Welcome to episode 13 of Feldenkrais, Moving into the Unknown, our podcast with Dale Dickens, Heidi Carroll and Libby Murray, where we are exploring all things Feldenkrais. And today, the three of us as students, Feldenkrais students in our third year of training, would like to introduce one of our peers, Jules Glinkowski. And Jules joins us today because she is going to introduce our guest for episode 13, Tara Eden. Jules met Tara along a somatic journey of her own. And we thought that this would be a great opportunity just to explore how people become interested in Feldenkrais, how the interest takes them and along the journey, because Tara Eden is actually a Feldenkrais practitioner practicing with her business is called Somatic Movement Project in Chiang Mai in Thailand. And Tara has been, Tara's also registered with the International Somatic Movement Education and Therapy Association, that's ISMETA. And we're sort of really interested in how Jules met Tara and the journey that Tara has taken to immerse herself in the Feldenkrais world, having intensely explored yoga and fitness. And I think from the way Tara puts it, the exposure to Feldenkrais has really changed the relationship between her mind and body. And I know Tara is very passionate about helping people reconnect to their body, learn from their own embodied experience, and become really empowered to trust the unique inner calm and sensations that can come from these somatic movement practices, including Feldenkrais. When we have almost like an embodied state change. So today, welcome to Tara, and I am going to ask Jules to perhaps describe how you met Tara back in 2014 and what was happening at that point along the somatic yoga journey. Yeah, so thanks, Jules.
Great, thank you. I met Tara. Hi, Tara. I met Tara in 2014 and was very grateful to have met her at that point. She was co-facilitating on a yoga retreat with a mutual friend of ours called Jade Wood, who I just realised, interestingly, is also now a Feldenkrais practitioner. So there's clearly something quite impactful in the work that you deliver, Tara, to put us all on this path. So I'm just wanting to introduce you and ask you to give us a bit of a backstory, because our paths have been quite similar along that introduction through yoga, and the similarities between us with Ashtanga and Iyengar and those more yang sort of practices, and in a way that yang way of being. So I'm interested for you to share what led you to this more yin somatic practice.
Thanks, Jules. So I should just start talking. Okay, well, interestingly, my journey that led to the Feldenkrais method probably started at childhood. I was one of those people that was experiencing what I call now embodied spirituality. I didn't go to church, we didn't have religion in my home, but I grew up in the countryside. And so I had a very intimate relationship with nature, and I was an only child for a long time before my sister came around. So I also spent a lot of time by myself. And I think, honestly, I really think that's where it started. A lot of feeling and sensing, connecting and playing that then wasn't squashed out as it is for a lot of kids. My mother had trained to be a movement therapist, which was, even more of an abstract concept at that time. So I always knew that there was something about the feeling of yourself, of oneself in movement, that was profoundly important to keep you tethered to your environment. Of course, now I realize that there's actually no difference between ourselves and our environment. We just end up creating that cognitively, psychologically. But so, from that point, I was a movement person. And again, like, the spiritual fabric of myself as a person came from my somatic experience of myself. And I went to theater school, and of course, everything you do in theater school is somatic. And then I got into yoga, and yoga was not a spiritual practice. I liked the heat and the power. And it was in a time in my life, like most young people, where I was trying to establish my sense of autonomy in the world, my sense of power. And then I got into traveling. And now looking back on it, I think of my period of traveling as research. I consider myself a student of the human condition. And I think in that 10-year period that I was traveling around, mostly I would just be sitting at bus stops observing people. And I also started getting blind drunk all the time. And that was important to me. And I was bartending to make money to travel more. So I eventually ended up in New Orleans, which is a city in the deep south of the United States. And I was a bartender there. And I was doing my damnedest to not feel anything. I had completely removed myself from myself. And what's interesting is, I think the Feldenkrais part of the journey actually started there, although it had been influenced previously by my observations, because I was working at dive bars, amongst other places. There was one dive bar that I worked at, and I would observe these inner city kids, these adolescents mainly, who were just destroyed. And that's not, sorry, that was too strong a word, not destroyed, but they were deeply anxious, and they were deeply afflicted. There was an incredible amount of violence, and literally kids shooting kids. There was so much teenage pregnancy. And what I would notice by just talking to them or observing them was this something about their body, some kind of like holding back or holding in. There was some level of repression and, of course, oppression that was happening. And I just kept having these visions of, if only I could create a container where these kids could just be kids experiencing themselves, dancing or laughing or rolling around, and not worried about their appearance, not worried about their pecking order and their hierarchy and survival and all the traumatic shit that they were had seen throughout their lives or continuing to see. And I realized that that was actually a vision that I had throughout my life. But then I had more drinking to do. So the idea was sort of put in the back of my mind. And then as I was getting close to 30, I sort of came up for air and was like, oh shit, if I don't extricate myself from this environment, I am never going to leave. I will wake up and be 70 and be still working at the bar and still drunk and whatever. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that wasn't the choice that I wanted for myself. So I went to New York with the intention of studying movement therapy, because I thought, okay, I already had such a strong sense that I knew what I wanted to express. I knew I had the energy for it. I knew how to create the container and make it accessible. And I just needed some logistics. I had to figure out how to kind of organize that. So when I was in New York, I did start studying dance movement therapy, and it was very clinical, which I didn't realize was a thing. And it was interesting, but it wasn't my thing. And I was also doing hot yoga at the gym. because again, I just wanted this feeling of heat and power, and I loved feeling strong. I was already naturally strong. I loved feeling my own strength. And I would always be at the back of the room, and the classes were always very easy for me because I was naturally strong and I was naturally flexible. And I remember very well, like it was yesterday, I had one teacher, this was in Brooklyn, I had one teacher who was always super made up, and this is in a hot yoga room. She was super made up with her nails, and she had this straight black hair that was like always perfectly down, and her makeup was on. But I loved her class. I don't remember what, it was probably the music or something. There's something about her class that I found very entertaining. And I remember one time after class, she stopped me and was like, hey, let me ask you, are you a yoga teacher? And I was like, looking around like, are you talking to me? Like, you know, I'm there in like sweat, like sweats with holes, you know what I mean? Like, and there's all these like fancy New York girls that are all like doing the Lululemon thing, whatever. And I was just like, no, what? No, I don't know. No, I'm not a yoga teacher. I don't know what you're talking about. She said, oh, because you look like a yoga teacher. And I was like, oh, what does a yoga teacher look like? You know? And I've thought about that a lot since then. But anyway, what was interesting was, until she said that to me, I didn't even know that someone could be a yoga teacher. I figured you had to like go to India. I was doing Ashtanga and related work. So anything I'd learned, the technical bits I'd learned about yoga was under the blanket of Ashtanga. And so I just thought you had to go to India and, you know, hang out with some guru there and whatever, you know. Anyway, so long story short is, through that power of suggestion, it occurred to me, this is back when, you know, yoga teacher trainings were really just becoming a thing. And so I was like, oh shit, that's how I can legitimize myself. That's how I start my Somatic Movement Project, is by becoming a yoga teacher. Because back then, being a yoga teacher meant something. I was like, oh, this legitimizes me. Hilarious. So I went and, you know, did the yoga teacher thing, and then kept doing more trainings because I was in New York and I didn't think I was good enough. So I kept training more, as opposed to just entering into that vulnerable space where you don't know what the hell you're doing, but you figure it out by doing it. And so I just got more into yoga, and I started teaching yoga, and I was trying to do community yoga. I was bringing somatic stuff into my yoga practice and into my yoga teaching, and my little following definitely appreciated that element that I was bringing to my classes. But it was still yoga. It was still a strong, powerful movement class that made you sweat and made you soar and made you feel like you were overcoming something. And I kept running with it. And again, being in New York, as anyone who's lived in New York knows, the pressure is extreme. The cream of the crop is in that city. And there's constantly some next level to aspire to. And there's so many inspiring people that are at the next level. And so I was just pushing myself and pushing myself. I had started also practicing, it was called Thai yoga massage. So I had my clients and I had my yoga practice and I had my bicycle, and I was just pushing and pushing and pushing. And it was actually through the massage clients that I started to accidentally feel again. I would be so inflamed from my yoga practice, from my anxiety, from my burnout, from my frustration with my life and achieving and all the things. And then I would have these sessions with these individuals, and some of them were so incredibly vulnerable that I couldn't not also be vulnerable with them in order to connect with them. And then I started having these like really, really powerful emotional, I want to call it, because that's all, it was energetic experiences. And I just thought, oh shit, I got to choose. If I'm going to let this out, if I'm going to reconnect to essence, to my sense of my environment and to myself, I got to get the fuck out of New York. Or I'm going to stay and I need to stop doing this stuff and just, you know, put my nose to the grindstone and keep pushing through like all of my friends were doing and totally getting off on. So it so happened that my mentors at the time for Thai massage. Thai yoga massage was the title that it had, based on the school I was studying at, Lotus Pond in Montreal, which is actually affiliated with the school here in Chiang Mai, the Sunshine School. So my teachers had either come from the Sunshine School here in Chiang Mai or not, but all of them had before that spent time with this person called Pichette, who is a master. Some people call him a shaman. He is not a person that teaches you the technique of Thai massage. He's a person that is a spiritual teacher, and he facilitates the transition from living your life leading with your thinking to living your life leading with your feeling. And the rest really fell into place from there. I was going religiously to see Pichette daily for about a week and a half, a year and a half. And at that time, I had my savings I was living off of from the money I'd made in New York. And so I wasn't working. And so I was rich in time. And because I was having all of these deep new feelings and connections from the work that I was doing with Pichette, the rest of my time I started doing mad research to figure out, how do I get this Somatic Movement Project off the ground in a way that isn't about wearing Lululemons and having a yoga bud and playing into that bullshit that ends up getting in the way of just an authentic experience of yourself. And I ended up, perusing YouTube for hours and trying all kinds of modalities. And eventually I found a awareness through movement lesson. It was by David Zemek-Burson. And I got on the floor and I did that lesson. And afterwards, I was like, what the fuck is this? And then, the rest is history, as they say. I had actually had experiences with Feldenkrais in my theater school days and years after that, and even briefly in my yoga time in New York. And I completely dismissed it, even though the description of it, the idea of learning how to sense yourself better and to make choices from your enriched sense of self as opposed to being directed externally or from sort of concept. Even though I liked the idea of that, I always liked the idea of that. When I was a yogi, I was like, no, if I'm not going to be doing chaturanga or getting stronger and more powerful, then that's not really interesting to me. So there I am on the floor in Chiang Mai. And it was exactly what I needed. And I think that is really, without exception, how people come into this practice. It's not medicine that you're just going to swallow. One way or another, there has to be this timing, this alignment.
So do you think, Tara, that life circumstances, I'm hearing that life circumstances had kind of contrived to sort of come together to have you in a place where you had enough time to actually pay attention to some of the sensations that were going on in yourself? And I'm hearing the very personal nature of that journey, but I think you've after then going on into the training, into the Feldenkrais training, it would be interesting to hear just how that then developed for you, because I think when Jules met you, it was about somatic yoga. Jules, it was a retreat, wasn't it, when you met Tara? And so from there, like what changed for you?
So again, I still had the same objective ultimately that I did to some degree as a child, which was creating a container that someone could experience themselves and all of their vulnerability, and the experience of their connection to their environment through that vulnerability. And I didn't have the balls to just do that. So I tried to figure out how I could inject that deeper into yoga. And like I said, in New York, I already had a somatic yoga practice that I was offering. So once I got to Chiang Mai and I didn't have the pressure of the people wanting their workout, and I had a little bit, again, like you say, I had time, and I also had leeway. The studio that I started teaching at was totally like, yeah, just come and do whatever you want to do. So I had a little test kitchen that I got to start playing around. And I started tweaking things, and I started injecting pieces of awareness through movement into my yoga teaching. And what's interesting, actually, and I think this is like such an important consideration for anybody that's trying to take the leap into doing their own thing outside of the construct of what they think they're supposed to do or what it's supposed to look like. I had already started teaching awareness through movement. I hope the Feldenkrais police don't take me away, but I started teaching awareness through movement long before I started my training. I can still say that with full confidence. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that people do it, because now that I have such a greater concept of the work, I realize that it's a bit, not a bit, it's quite cheapening to just be reproducing what you're hearing in a lesson. And yet I think I also had a deeply spiritual association with the work I was doing. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I was doing these classes that had Feldenkrais injected into them, into the yoga. And then slowly in my home, I was offering awareness through movement classes. And I would listen to a tape, to an audio, a tape, that's funny. And I would memorize it, and then I would offer it. And, you know, I was a yoga teacher, so I knew how to teach groups, right? And I would do the same thing. You know, it was like the details of the movement and the awareness of movement wasn't important. I was trying to help create a container so that people could undergo a state change other than just like sitting in meditation and willing it, right? So at some point, I started doing these little workshops and immersions. And one of my students who'd been coming quite religiously to the awareness through movement finally asked me, why are you calling what you're doing somatic yoga? She said, I haven't been doing your workshops because I didn't want to do yoga. And she said, but your classes, we're not doing yoga. So what? And I was like, well, you know, I'm calling it that because again, that fear, like, well, I need it to be a thing that people know, or that's already sexy, or that's already likable. And really, I owe it to her to have that clarity of like, okay, so what if I actually do what I want to be doing? And maybe it means that only 2 people come instead of 18 people. And that's what I fucking did, right? I said, okay, so let me cater to the 2. And the 2 wasn't 2, the 2 was 5. And the 5 turned into 10. And then I started doing immersions and programs, and more people liked what it was that I was offering. And it was it was my infusion into Feldenkrais that had influences from yoga, that had influences from being a tree fairy, that had whatever other influences. So I went and did the training because I felt like, again, I wanted to legitimize myself. I wanted to understand practice. I wanted to understand the history. I wanted to know more about the scientist, Moshe Feldenkrais, that created the thing. But again, my intention was never wavering in terms of what I hoped to help people do.
I'm just loving your story. It's so nice to be a part of. I've got 2 questions. So can you sort of describe a bit what your somatic yoga, like obviously it evolved, but when you were doing your sort of standard yoga class, what was the core elements that you kept bringing into that then gave it that real living, sensing, feeling experience?
Choice.
And then obviously was there just expanding their awareness as far as going into that sensing, feeling self?
It meant that when they realized they had a choice, that they could find their way into the posture, as opposed to the posture forming them. When they had the choice to not do such a good job, when they had a choice to have their elbow bent or their head turned, that reference of this feels this way and that feels that way already starts to bolster your experience of your own body. So again, this is one of my biggest pet peeves about yoga, especially now with all, you know, being a body worker and studying anatomy so intensively. And it's, I mean, like any exercise, you can't possibly, it's not one size fits all. So you can't possibly put everyone's body into those shapes. So people having the choice to rest, the choice to adapt how they were doing things, started to elicit a deeper connection to themselves, instead of just focusing on, I've got to do this the right way, and I've got to feel the burn or push through the burn or whatever the shit is that people are going through in that yoga asana practice.
And the other comment that you made was that you want them to have a shift in their state, a shift in their feeling. Can you expand on what you're actually meaning by that?
It's funny, you know, Moshe Feldenkrais has, people love to quote all these, you know, these classic lines. There's one of his classic lines, I don't know it verbatim, but the story was that, his line was that you can tell somebody, you can tell somebody you'll love a mango. It's so tasty. It's kind of like a peach, but it's a bit more floral, and you know, sometimes it's a bit more like a lemon, whatever. But nobody knows what a mango is until they taste a damn mango, right? So I can attempt to talk about a state change, but a state change is a state change. So nobody can know what a state change is until you go through it. The closest approximation could be if you get lost in a piece of music, or art, or dance, or maybe observing your children or another person that you love, looking at a spectacular nature vista, the sea, the feeling that you get suddenly where you are not defined by the overactivity or just the activity of your mind, that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And we can get there by tapping into our sensation, not trying to elicit a strong feeling. Actually, the opposite of that, by reducing the amount of intensity, reducing the amount of strong sensation, strong feedback, so much so that the richness of what you are feeling gets so much more heightened, and that can be much more intriguing for not just your mind, but your whole nervous system than all the nattering bullshit that most of us are consumed by.
So when you were talking about your Thai yoga massage teacher, he said about leading with feeling. So does that have parallels with the Feldenkrais method?
I mean, for me, that absolutely. Again, it's, you know, it's funny, Heidi, this like all these different words, right? We have all these different words for kind of the same thing, right?
Yeah.
The flow state, the alignment, the feeling, the self-knowing. I think actually that's probably worth saying very explicitly, is that the feeling-led reality, leading with your feeling as opposed to your critical thinking, allows this element of self-knowing that is difficult to otherwise access.
I guess there's a danger there in thinking, I guess, about what feels good, and that initial idea of, you know, not getting out of bed, getting drunk, that whole idea that what may feel good, and that is what people could think is what's leading them, as opposed to the purity. Do you understand what I'm saying? That there's
absolutely. Oh, yeah. It's brilliant. Oh yeah.
And how
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's just that I think I've been pondering that ideal in myself of knowing that sometimes following that feeling is not necessarily that initial outcome. It's sort of more a long-term thing, maybe.
You mean the difference between chasing a good feeling versus feeling more?
Yeah, and chasing just that good feeling in that moment. You know, it feels great to eat that hamburger, whatever, that chocolate or whatever, but then there's this sort of slide down, and but there's something else, because I guess feeling's a bit loaded in a way. It's almost a state, like you were saying, maybe.
Well, here, I mean, let me ask you to, on that point. So for you, what are some of the characteristics that are different from when you're super high, super happy, super blissed out on something versus when for you, you're in the state change?
What's the difference? I guess it's in that feeling good and that driving it's wanting more, feeling like you want to be more or do more, as opposed to there's a peacefulness and a purity in being, I guess, that is possibly what you're referring to.
Mm-hmm. So
I don't know. I was going to say, Tara, I was going to say noticing. I'm just thinking myself, I think the difference, in answer to your question, would be in the stillness, in the noticing, in the pauses, and in the rest times. There's an expansiveness as opposed to a nothingness. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I think those are both brilliant examples. I think the pause changes the quality of the feeling, and also the tenor of it. If it's something that you want to sustain, then you're already in a different state than you are if you're just observing pause. By definition, observing a pause is being in a different state than being like, oh, I'm super high, I'm going to try to really keep super high. And I think the other important element is also realizing that feeling is not necessarily good feeling. I come up against this a lot with my private clients. And actually, now that I think of it, it used to come up a lot in these immersions that I used to teach. This whole idea of ignorance is bliss. And as people improve their ability to feel themselves, sometimes a lot of shit came up, and it isn't nice, and it's not blissful, and it's not happy, and it doesn't feel good. And I think what's super, super interesting and important is to begin this process of differentiating between what is uncomfortable because it is wrong and what is uncomfortable because it is new.
New or just unfamiliar, not necessarily new, but it might have been something that was present, you know, a long time ago, and it's either been repressed or forgotten, unfamiliar.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
The important question that comes up here, though, especially these days with, you know, trauma-centered everything is such a focal point, especially the pandemic where everyone's freaking the fuck out. The other thing that comes up a lot is, you know, for example, I work with one woman who suffers panic attacks, and she doesn't want to feel what she's feeling. That's why she's having a panic attack. She's already having a panic attack. So there's an interesting conversation that comes up then about, okay, so how is somatic work, and I even invite you, so how is somatic work applicable or accessible to people that are already undergoing some kind of trauma or severe anxiety, panic attack, and or, you know, sexual abuse, whatever the scenario that they deliberately don't want to feel. They've done their damnedest to try not to feel, and then starting to feel is excruciating.
Yeah. I can definitely relate to that. That's a fascinating question, and I think one really worth investigating. And just, you know, jumping from yoga into Feldenkrais, was it the ideas of the pauses and the noticing that really led you? I think at one stage you put it that you divorced yoga, but I think Jules wanted you you might want to ask that question, Jules, about, you know, what happened then. I'm interested in this transition between yoga and Feldenkrais, and then further into sort of the embodiment.
wonder if you can relate to this, Jules. Or I actually, and I wonder if people relate to it in general, but I think for me, yoga was an opportunity for me to act out my self-loathing. It was a place that I could punish myself. It was a place that I could push harder, that I could literally feel pain and push into the pain. And for me to reconcile my anxiety and my fear, my self-loathing, I could only imagine to meet my own intensity with equal amounts of intensity. And even with yin, which is, oh, it's a restorative practice. Yin, you just lay there and bypass the fucking pain for an hour and a half, right? This was the kind of container that I thought was my therapy. I mean, I would have been on such a soapbox about it. And now I actually think that, and not that everyone was practicing like I do, but I know that Jules was, or maybe still is sometimes, I don't know, dabbling, sleeping around. Yeah, one way is, again, forcing yourself into the expression of something to try to strangle yourself with it or to get out of it, versus the other is literally being supported by it. I mean, there's actually no comparison. And again, I know there'll be so many yogis that are like, I have a gentle practice and it feels nice. I don't strain my body and it's helped my mobility. And I think that's wonderful if you have found a yoga practice that is nurturing and nourishing to you. And my only inquiry in that scenario would be, is there anything that limits you based on the structure of the literally the planes of movement of your movement, the discipline of doing the same kind of movements, and to just inquire, is there any limitations to your choice in the way that you're doing yoga?
I think that when you were saying that contrast of how you were meeting yoga and how it was this sort of self-loathing process, that maybe Feldenkrais and somatics means that you can meet yourself in a different way. And even if it is a negative feeling, you can actually, instead of pushing up or resisting it or pushing harder, that you can actually just find a different way to greet it. Is that what you think you're offering when people come to your class, or, It's
come up, this word, made up word, I guess. It's funny because I used to think it all the time. It came up in the immersions, and a person that I'm working with right now just said it, this idea of okayness. So we're not looking for the big high. We're not looking for the buns of steel. We're not looking to solve all of our fucking problems. We're just looking for a little bit of okayness. And I think that there's, again, I've also had students that have come and have done awareness through movement, and they've been like, oh, I just can't do it because there's so many instructions, and I keep asking myself if I'm doing it right, and what should I be doing, and what should I be feeling? And that's the process we all go through with awareness through movement, right? And again, that's going full circle. That's why I say you can only meet this work when you're ready to meet this work. When you're ready to literally change your own thinking about what you're doing.
Tara, I know that you do have your practice in Chiang Mai in Thailand, and I was interested in the people that you're seeing there. Are people seeking you out for this particular reason? Like, if you can just speak a bit about the clientele that you have, and I know you also do some pro bono work there in Chiang Mai, but about the range of people you see and about what brings people to the Feldenkrais method in Chiang Mai, and is there anything different about the way people are finding you as opposed to just coming because they've got a pain in a certain part of their body? Are they seeking something more?
It's an interesting question. So about half of my practice now is online, doing Zoom privates, and half is in person. And about half of the people that I work with are people that had come to one of my immersion programs and or had been referred by someone that had done one of those programs. And I have people that are trying to overcome office syndrome, improve their, their overall posture. I have people that come to me because they are crippled by anxiety, and they literally, the one woman that I work with talks about how she has a therapist and she's been doing the brain piece for a long time, and it's just kind of dawned on her like, oh, there's something's missing. So now she's doing the somatic piece with me. Interestingly, it's extremely rare that anybody already knows about Feldenkrais when they seek me out. That's like my biggest fantasy, is that someone's just like, it actually happened. A fellow from Australia last year sometime wrote me and was like, hey, you're a Feldenkrais practitioner, I want to do some FI. And I just like nearly fell over with joy. I was like, oh my God, I don't have to explain anything to you. I don't have to like hold your hand while you figure out what this is like for you. You're just going to choose this. This is amazing. So I also have people that come to the awareness for movement class, and they have a particular, usually it's some kind of mobility or pain, like you say, issue that they want to get a little bit of personal attention about. And yeah, that can be in Zoom or that can be in person. I also have the honor of working with the person that I call my teacher. She is my biggest teacher. She is a 2.5-year-old Burmese girl that has a very severe chromosomal disorder. And so she's pre-verbal, and she hasn't yet figured out how to sit by herself or to crawl. Well, she has her own way of crawling, not traditional crawling. So I work with them, trying to help her improve her sense of herself, and we're making some progress. We've been working together about a year. And then finally, I have some people that friends that like me, I think is where it starts a lot. And they're like, I like you, and you spend a lot of time studying. So I have a feeling that you might be able to offer me something. I think, and then these days I started a kind of completely by accident, I've started offering a mentorship program because I got certified through Ismeta, like you said, Livy. And as a registered somatic movement therapist, I can offer 500 hours of mentorship to other individuals that would like to also get certified. There's still requirements in terms of professional hours, but right now, just by bizarre coincidence, I have three different individuals that sought me out, all kind of super weirdly, randomly. And for each of them, I was like, oh, why don't you go find a training program? Like it'll be organized and you'll know what to expect. And, and all of them were like, no. And so 2 of them moved here to Thailand. They've actually just arrived. One arrived a couple weeks ago, one just arrived about a week ago. They've just totally relocated to Thailand. Let me say, full stop, it's a great excuse to come to Thailand, okay? If you were sort of like, I would like a reason to leave my life for 2 weeks, 1 month, 6 months, a year, coming and doing a personalized mentorship is probably a great way to tell your parents or your friends, your colleagues, your work friends who are like, where are you going and what are you doing? Oh, no, I'm not going to just sit on the beach in Thailand for a year. I'm going to study. I'm going to do some deep, committed study. So it might be a little bit of that too. But regardless, yeah. And so that just talking about it makes me kind of tingle, because I actually thought that I was moving away from that kind of work, especially when I started working with that baby. I was like, okay, this is what I want to be doing, working with special needs children. This is so intimate. Not working with adults and their problems and their judgments and their words. I was like, this is amazing. Just give me a baby. Let me put my hands on a baby, and I leave seeing the baby and I'm all energized and I'm all like peaceful. And so I was like, this is great. This is what I'm going to do. And then, this expression of life happens while you're making other plans, just when I'd sort of fully committed, like, I'm not going to do any more group facilitation and I'm not going to work with any more adults. I'm going to start really focusing in on this. And then these 3 individuals contacted me and were like, we would like to dedicate a year to a year and a half of our lives to doing some really deep study with you. And so I've already started with one of them, and it's just off the charts, fun and interesting, and an honor that this person can be so vulnerable with me and that I can support them in their process. And You know, I never think I know anything about anything. And I'm like, oh, this is really amazing to get clear about, like, oh shit, you know, there's so many things that I at this point, I'm so immersed in it, I kind of forget that it doesn't just come, you know, come in the box or whatever. And I'm like, oh my God, so amazing to be like, oh, there's really tools that I have and ways of thinking and being that can actually really help you feel empowered and access yourself. And oh my God, it's, so I don't, you know, we'll see how it goes if it continues. But ironically, now I can really see myself getting much deeper into that kind of work.
It's really interesting, Tara, that it's almost like a living into process, like living into the life. And I'm wondering, with there's a broad scope there of what you've been working with, and with the people who are seeking out Feldenkrais, is there a way that you think we need to sort of change how we offer Feldenkrais? And is there a way that we could offer it in a way that really broadens it for people, that really brings in people without them necessarily just coming with the sore knee, so to speak?
That makes me think that you've got an idea about that. What do you think?
Well, we're thinking about it. One of the reasons for having the podcast is for having these conversations. And yeah, so I think it's something worth investigating, just because of the times we're living in the world. And you're obviously in the area where you're seeing such a range. Yeah.
So I guess I could ask you, how do you then, you say that people don't know Feldenkrais, so how do you then actually introduce people to the world of Feldenkrais? And maybe that can help us as well.
Yeah, I mean, I got to be honest with you. There's definitely this leap of faith piece that's involved with it. And, you know, sometimes, so one thing I do, for example, is I have this intro package that I offer, 3 sessions within 7 days, because I know that in 3 sessions, I can get a really concrete sense of somebody, at least to know how Feldenkrais could be valuable to them, or if it's maybe not something that is super accessible, or maybe there's some other work that needs to be done first or whatever. And people like the idea of that. I mean, again, here in Chiang Mai, we're blessed into a community of super open-minded people that are curious about self-improvement, curious about personal growth and development. So without exception, it's always somebody that has referred, someone who's talked about the work they've done with me, they've told their friend about it, and their friend's like, cool, let me go check that out. And then they come. And yes, certainly some people come and they'll do a 3 series and I never see them again. I used to actually beat myself up about that a lot. Like, I totally shit the bed on this one. You know, I didn't make it accessible enough to them, or I didn't make it interesting enough to them. And there's probably some truth to that, you know, but it's also not necessarily that I missed the mark so much as there's a certain alchemy, you guys know, with any facilitator or therapist and individual. And you know, I'm sure any of the oldies in Feldenkrais would agree that we are always constantly learning and evolving. So maybe if I see that same person again after 5 years, maybe I'll be more crafty and, you know, where I can access them that makes it accessible. Maybe not, right? It's all just this perfect timing and alignment that has to happen. What I do on a technical note is I try to get a really clear sense of how the person sees themselves, and the symptom is kind of irrelevant. It really depends on how they feel about themselves. Going back to what you were saying, Heidi, about the whole like self-loathing versus the other, and the other is self-love, right? And so Feldenkrais, you know, it's interesting because we can often get lost in the idea of improvement, which is another whole podcast in itself. But I think we have to be very careful, because improvement can somehow be indicative of a lacking. And what we're trying to do is not make someone different than how they are. We want people to access the self that they aren't accessing already. And you have to really be careful with that. Also, people want to put things into boxes. immediately. They want to categorize, they want to evaluate, this is good, this is bad. I should do it like this, I shouldn't do it like that. I have a bad knee, I have a bad heart, I have terrible breathing, I have good whatever, so I think what certainly they never talked about in my training programs, and I got to moonlight in a few, is this piece around being able to be with somebody, observe them, and listen to them. Actually listen to them is difficult as a practitioner, and also probably ultimately what we all want in a practitioner, right?
I think that's beautifully said. I just love some of the things you've said there, Tara, and just I think it comes back to you being an observer from the beginning. I'm hearing a really big depth in your practice and breadth of practice, and you became a Feldenkrais practitioner sort of somewhere along that line, almost immersing yourself in that process. It's just, I get tingles with this feeling of actually what you're offering people, and I mean personally, I'm hoping to offer that myself. How do you, when you enter into this space of deep listening with people, how do you take care of yourself in that process?
That's a great question. Yeah, that is a great question. I think I often suck at it. I think I often suck at taking care of myself. Yeah, exactly. Because, perfect irony, probably the people that it's easiest for to listen and to observe are empathetic people and highly sensitive people. And then, of course, highly sensitive people are also going to be the most affected by the person that they're listening to. There's a kind of a running gag about doctors having no personality or no people skills. Well, thank God, because if they're all just these gushing, bleeding hearts, no one would get their wound healed or fixed or whatever. But anyway, yeah. So, I mean, here's the most cliche thing I could possibly say, but it's also completely true. The resource that I have to maintain my boundaries and my grounding and my sense of self is my somatic practice. If I spend my days off exclusively YouTubing or Netflixing or talking on the phone or doing very cerebral external things, I'm going to have a harder week. Guaranteed, I'm going to have a harder week. If I can take time to reconnect to myself religiously, daily, all the time, the better I am at doing that. I don't have to do it obsessively. I mean, another joke, not joke, is that I'm also slowly losing my ability to socialize, because now I'm just constantly listening and connecting so much that I actually don't even know how to be in an environment where you're just like light and chatty and, talk about any bullshit, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. But yeah.
It's kind of ironic that people seeking this, in these days, time to connect with themselves is really, it's really, I suppose, offered by so many different practices, whether it be yoga or other forms of therapy. But it's really only Feldenkrais, I think, that's really given me an actual experience of what that is, to connect with the self. So, yeah, that's what I guess we're offering people. But, yeah.
Isn't that ironic, right? Because, Feldenkrais is not sexy. It's not easy to advertise. And how ironic that the thing that is actually steeped in authenticity is the thing that, of course, it's the thing that isn't sexy and that you can't advertise, right? But then, yeah, if you want to have a career and bolster an industry without marketing, and nowadays where our entire reality is online, it gets very complicated to maintain any kind of authenticity.
I'm hearing that you just jumped into it, though, in the immersive experience, and that's a really positive line of thought for us as practitioners aiming to graduate and step into this work. So I think for people really listening in, whether they have tried Feldenkrais before or whether they haven't tried Feldenkrais, whether they're coming from yoga or whether they're thinking about doing Feldenkrais training. Some of our listeners might be even thinking of that, you know, they're yoga practitioners or yoga devotees, and there might be something else that they're seeking. Yeah. How would you recommend them bridging that? Aside from taking a Feldenkrais training, would it be seeking out a Feldenkrais practitioner? But are we all the same, or is it just about that alchemy, that connecting with the individual person?
You mean, how does someone bridge the gap to get into that work?
Yeah, or bridge the gap. I think if they're seeking to connect with themselves and they're perhaps, I suppose you'd have to be aware that maybe you were still looking for something or lacking something, or perhaps not quite satisfied. It's not that in Feldenkrais we find the thing that we're looking for. I'm hearing your conversation about the okayness in there, and that it's more a place of acceptance of oneself, which I think Moshe Feldenkrais put forward anyway in a lot of his work, that it is about accepting self. And I just like the part you said about, you know, if we're looking for improvement, I think he first called his book Awareness Through Movement. The book was first called Improving Abilities. And I mean, we talk about awareness, but the original title of the book was Improving Abilities, but it's in the noticings and the ways that happens in a Feldenkrais session. Not quite sure where my question is there.
I think what you're saying. It reminds me of a few years ago, my sister was having a lot of anxiety, and I asked her if she had given meditation a try. And she said, yeah, I tried meditation and it just made me more crazy. Just turned up the volume of my thoughts that were already making me crazy. So I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, Libby, is that, you know, so it's interesting because ironically, the way to start to do these embodiment practices is through trusting yourself. And yet an embodiment practice is a process of learning to trust yourself. So it's like, you know, doing double Dutch, like where do you find your in? And so that's where I say, again, there's an element of leap of faith. Like if you're at a breaking point with your anxiety, with your pain, with your frustration, with your life being the same, at some point someone's just going to say, fuck it, I'm just going to try something different. And that might be literally what it comes down to. The other thing that I would suggest as a strategy, which it makes me giggle to say that it's a strategy. It reminds me of like an Emperor's New Clothes kind of scenario, but it keeps coming up, and I mean this from the core of my being. All of us have an exceptional resource in the ground. I would suggest as a strategy, really, truly, and maybe the first time it doesn't work, and maybe the 6th time it doesn't work, and the 10th time, and maybe the 20th time something changes, but as a strategy, give yourself a container. Take a stopwatch. Tell yourself it's going to be 1 minute. It's going to be 5 minutes. It's going to be 10 minutes. Don't challenge yourself. Give yourself an easy container. Put a stopwatch. Lay down on the floor.
Yeah, or lay down outside under a tree. I've heard that said too.
Yeah. But then the hard thing, you know, it's like, well, and then what do I do? What am I supposed to feel? Right. And so let all that come up. What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to feel? And stay there. And just stay and be with yourself and be with your crazy. And do it 10 times, 15 times, and watch what happens on the 20th time that you do it. Watch how things start to change, how your experience starts to change.
So I guess, would it be then fair to say, Tara, that that's what you're offering in ATM, that you're actually offering a more formal process for a person to be able to lie down with themselves and be?
Totally. I mean, Feldenkrais is an incredible lens, and you know, depending on some trainers, it can get extremely technical, almost militant in some ways, ironically. And I love it as a one way to get into the pool. But yeah, at the end of the day, my work personally is about how do I support somebody in their process of making their way onto the floor, of reconnecting in that way that I had whatever unlikely blessing of having had access to since my earliest memories. And that's not a thing that was just exclusively bestowed upon me. That's a human thing that I was lucky enough to have access to. So that's really my work. I think I can help you find that.
I think that's a really beautiful note to finish on. If we've come full circle, that you started with your Somatic Movement Project as a child, that you've come fully around, and now you can offer that to yourself constantly and then to other people in your classes. I love that your yoga story is about empowerment, and it is that strong, real gross sense of self that you're trying to find. But then you get to frustration, you got through anxiety, the burnout, so much so of what our whole society is about at the moment. It's just such a chronic issue throughout most people's life. So then this led you to leading with feeling, to actually finding a different place to be, and that you could experience yourself authentically. And you found a container in Feldenkrais, and that you can offer this to other people. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you.
It's been a wonderful conversation. So Tara Eden has been with us today. You can find her at somaticproject.com. You have some free audio lessons on Feldenkrais with Tara on YouTube. You've got private Zoom lessons that people can connect with you. And then there's group Zoom classes as well as live classes in Thailand. So we, from Libby and Jules and myself, we thank you again, Tara, for joining us. And thank you to our listeners, so that we're moving into the unknown again. And join us next time when we have Lavinia joining us. Thanks very much. Bye. Oh, I don't.